one great hour sharing makes such a significant difference around the world.
Welcome to the One Great Hour of Sharing podcast, brought to you by Encore. Today, we're talking about the ministry of relief and hope that Encore is bringing around the world and how your church can get involved. Thanks for joining us as we get ready for One Great Hour of Sharing on the fourth Sunday of Lent.
Well, welcome to the One Great Hour of Sharing podcast. This is the podcast where we count down to the fourth Sunday of Lent, where we're inviting your church to join in this incredible Sunday that supports the unbelievable work of UMCOR through a special offering. And on today's conversation, we have Greg Forrester. Greg, thanks so much for being on the call today.
Oh, happy to be here with you.
I'm excited for this conversation as I was looking forward to this because I think you've got a really unique position for us to understand what UMCOR is all about and also how One Great Hour Sharing can help in the amazing work of UMCOR. So why don't we start with just give us a sense of what's your role within UMCOR?
Well, within UMCOR, we have really three divisions. One is the U.S. Disaster Response Area, and then the other is the International Disaster Response, and then the third is our Development Office. And so I lead the U.S. Disaster Response Area, which includes all of the United States, the Caribbean, and also Central America. Okay,
nice. So what's a typical day for you? Is there a typical day when you work in disaster response?
There really isn't a typical day. I give you, for instance, for today, you may or may not be aware, but there was a chemical spill in Charleston, West Virginia overnight.
Okay, no, I didn't know that.
And so this morning at about 8 o'clock, my cell phone rang, and I had a request for, do we have any shower trailers available that we can actually mobilize and get to West Virginia to provide for the emergency workers that are there who can no longer use the shower water or any of the water in the area. Huh. And so I spent the morning trying to find resources for a shower trailer and then also some bottled water that might be available through our material resource area, which I also oversee.
That's amazing to think. Here it is on a day where, most people in our churches are just doing normal things, and here's this little, one part of it trying to figure out how to get a shower trailer. That's amazing. That's incredible.
Yeah, very, very different. And then the other part of my morning was spent, we're sending a grant to the St. Vincent Island in the Caribbean because they had flooding on Christmas Eve. Most people don't realize, but St. Lucia, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and Dominica all had flash flooding on Christmas Eve. Oh, wow. And so we're working on providing some grants for some supplies to go to there as well.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Well, why don't we take a step back, and for folks who maybe aren't even aware who UMCOR is, maybe they've heard that word or they've even heard the United Methodist Committee on Relief. That can be a bit of a mouthful. But what is UMCOR? Maybe give us a sense of the history. What's the work that takes place within UMCOR?
Well, it basically started from back in World War II, and they were working on overseas relief missions, and then it kind of transitioned in the mid-'60s where we started looking at, well, we're really good at doing disaster work outside of the U.S., but internally, how do we go ahead and structure some things? And so the U.S. Disaster Office for UMCOR sort of got pulled together, and we started looking at each of the regions and the annual conferences and churches and saying, how can we best equip our own churches here in the U.S. to be responsive to their disasters in their own communities? And so what we've really gone to is really here in the U.S. is more of a resourcing agency for the local churches, for the annual conferences, so they can respond to disasters in their own communities. And we come alongside of them with expertise, financial resources, and other things so that we make this connection work when disaster happens here.
Now, why don't we break that down a little bit? So let's say, there's a disaster happening in, somewhere, a Katrina, or something like that's just massive, obviously. But let's say a disaster happening in some part of the country. How does UMCOR actually respond? How does your office and the people you work with respond to that?
Well, we'll use the example of West Virginia that just happened this morning.
That's a good call, yeah.
And so, because it's real relevant and pertinent for today, because we respond to not only natural disasters, but also man-made disasters. And so with the chemical spill this morning, it started with a phone call from the disaster response coordinator of the West Virginia Annual Conference. And that's how we connect within UMCOR. Our first connection is through every annual conference by disciplinary requirement, if we want to use that good old word that we like so much. But by our rule book says we are to have a disaster response coordinator in every annual conference. And so then that person is the one I directly resource. And so he or she will make the phone call and say, listen, we've got a disaster, we need some help. Here's the kind of help that we need. And they actually identify what they need. And then we try to find the resources to meet their articulated need. And then we involve immediately the bishop's office is involved. They have to make a request for funding, which we can do immediately. Like with West Virginia, if they decided they needed money today, we can actually give them a grant of $10,000 today.
Wow.
To start that work. I mean, that's how quickly that can happen.
Really? I didn't realize how fast that, but I guess in a situation like that, timing is so critical, right? Because people need to be buying supplies today, right? They need to be out making stuff happen on the ground.
Right. So we look at it in terms of the actual emergency, which that's how we're involved in that first phase of it. And then it kind of, the disasters kind of transition to a long-term recovery kind of mode. And so what we do is we walk with the annual conference from the beginning of the disaster until the full recovery period is taking place. And there's different resources that we bring in at the different phases of the disaster.
Right. Okay. So now, how does One Great Hour of Sharing connect with all that? What's its place within the overall mix?
Well, for us, One Great Hour Sharing is the way that we cover the administrative costs of UMCOR. Without One Great Hour Sharing funds, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. And so it's very self-motivating for me as far as making sure that I have employment, but also what it allows us to do is saying the administrative costs of responding to the needs around not only the U.S. but around the world, the administrative costs are borne by that offering. And so then when people give to the actual disasters and what they see when it's rolling out and occurring, 100% of those other funds they donate can go directly to that disaster and not have to go to administrative support.
Yeah, to me, that's amazing. That's what an incredible gift, because in a moment like that, it's unfortunately we live in a world where we know there's going to be more disasters, right? There's going to be things, whether it's things that make the national news or not. I love that you've used this example today of this, chemical spill, because, a lot of people didn't turn on the TV and necessarily see that this morning. Whether it's, things that are getting national attention or not. But when people give at that moment, when there is that opportunity to give down the road, the fact that none of that money is going to go to pay the infrastructure cost, the administrative cost, is amazing. Like what a gift to the church and to people giving in that moment. That's incredible.
Absolutely, and there's very few organizations that are doing this kind of work that can actually say that, and we have the ability to do it because of One Great Hour Sharing and the way that the church responds to that offering. It really allows us then to do what we do and say 100% goes out. And you were talking about the number of disasters that people don't hear about. I came on board in this position May 1st, so I'm rather new to this position. Mm-hmm. Not new to the church. I've been working in it in volunteer management for the last 13 or more years. But since May 1st, we've had 24 declared disasters here in the United States.
Wow. That's amazing. Now, what happens? How does a disaster become declared? What is that process?
If it gets large enough, well, first on the state level, like already with West Virginia this morning, they declared it because they've got 300,000 people that are without water at this point in time and not knowing where it's going to clear up. So they'll have a state level declared disaster, and then from there, if it's large enough, it'll move to a federally declared disaster.
Wow.
And so they happen all the time. We just don't always see them on the news.
Yeah, so that's like every other week kind of thing. When you think about the time frame, or a little more than that, that we're declaring a disaster just in this country, let alone the work you're doing around the world.
That's correct.
So now, one of the things I've heard multiple people say is that UMCOR's, financial stewardship is just impeccable. That your desire to use finances in a wise manner, is off the charts, is one of the real distinctives of UMCOR. I'm wondering, as someone who obviously you're in the seat of seeing how resources are spent, how are the gifts that come through One Great Hour of Sharing used? What are some of those ways that you've seen that, been used well?
Well, the One Great Hour Sharing, to give you an idea, like I said, it's used for really the administrative side of our house. Mm-hmm. People wonder, how do we do this within UMCOR and what's our staffing levels? Are we really top heavy? And
right.
Things. To let you know, we run the whole U.S. Disaster Response Office for UMCOR with 3 people.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
There's myself as the Assistant General Secretary. I have Kathy Earle, who's the Executive Secretary, who handles some of the grant management and some of the training aspects. And then I have one support staff in my Washington, D.C. office who handles all the paperwork to make the rest of it happen.
Absolutely.
So with three people, we really run the whole disaster response office for the United States.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. But it's also because of the connectional system within the annual conferences, we're able then to go ahead and utilize the funds from one great hour sharing to minimize the amount of personnel we need to implement program by resourcing the local church really in the response. But we draw it all into one pot. We're able to go ahead and accumulate and assimilate all that information and then make it available with a very small staff.
Now, how many volunteers, like when you actually mobilize out into the ground, do you have a sense of what that number would be? How many volunteers you maybe mobilize in say, a typical year with UMCOR?
Well, actually, it's an interesting question. UMCOR really doesn't mobilize the volunteers. Right. We have a sister organization called UMVIM, which is United Methodist Volunteers in Mission. And what we do through UMCOR is work very tightly with UMVIM to go ahead and make sure that the volunteers are coming in to the disaster zone in a very timed process as they're needed. And so what we do is at UMCOR is we do train the early responders. So we have what we call ERTs, early response teams. And they are just specialized UMVIM teams, but they're trained and badged by UMCOR. So in a given year, right now within the U.S. system, we have about 15,000 badged and trained ERT members.
Wow.
Now, as far as fielding volunteers, when we actually set up a disaster for the immediacy and then in the long-term recovery, we can have anywhere from there's 1 million plus volunteers that go out a year.
Wow. That's amazing.
So it's pretty phenomenal how the system works and how by using the one great hour sharing funds, I'm able to go ahead and set up systems by which we can bring in volunteers, which multiplies then the value of the dollars that are given even in response to the disaster. It's a really interesting way that it multiplies.
Yeah, that is amazing when you think of the resources that are being leveraged there, and you have those 15,000, you're just thinking that's like an army, just waiting to respond to needs here. And they've been trained by UMCOR, they've been prepped by, your teams ready to go. And then there's the broader group who is ready to jump in boards. And that's all managed by 3 people. That's crazy, right? Or resourced by 3 people.
Resourced by 3. Yeah, it's managed by many more, but it's resourced by 3.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, what else would you like? Let's say there's a church leader that's listening in today, and they maybe are, they're hesitant. They're maybe not involved in one great hour of sharing, haven't been in the past. What would you say to them? What else would you say to them just as we wrap up today's conversation?
Just for me, just letting them know that one great hour sharing makes such a significant difference around the world. Not only with what we've been talking about with the U.S. Disaster Office, but our International Disaster Office is actually run just as lean as my office is, as well as our development office. But by going ahead and participating in one great hour sharing and covering those administrative costs, we really do leverage so much more across the world for relief, humanitarian relief, to dozens and dozens of places on an annual basis. And so it's pretty phenomenal if the church steps up and participates with us in this. And that's really how I see all of our ministry. It's the church participating with us in their mission to share Christ around the world.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you very much. God bless.
Thank you for joining us for the One Great Hour of Sharing podcast. We want your church to join us for this special Sunday that supports the vital work of UMCOR. Drop by umcor.org for more information on how to get involved.